Thank you, first of all, for the invite to come here. It's the first time I've been to the Green Academy, but if you have it on such beautiful islands, then you might get me to come again a few times, I think. So it's wonderful to be here, especially coming from Scotland in August, where the temperature in Glasgow yesterday was 12 degrees at midday. That's our normal August summer temperature, so it's great to be here. More importantly, it's great to be here because I think it's always fantastic to be around kind of collection of people that share the same values and views that you do about the catastrophic situation we face as a society and as a planet, and therefore the need to move to a very different kind of economic system to the one we have today. So it's always good to kind of, I find it revitalizes your spirit just being together with people who share those kind of social and ecological views. Now, as you'll be aware, my name's Andy Cumbers. I work at the University of Glasgow. I think I would loosely define myself as a political economist, but my work sort of tends to skirt across all areas of politics, economics, sociology, and indeed human geography as well. But what I've been most concerned with over the last 10 years or so has been the issue of economic democracy, and also really rethinking what we mean by economic democracy in a far more radical way than we've had in the past. Particularly pertinent to producing a different kind of economics around, well, I think the phrase that we're talking about a lot these days is degrowth, rather than the kind of growth agenda. And as part of that commitment to an economic democracy project, or a radical economic democracy project, I've been writing quite a lot about the issue of public ownership and what can a revitalized public ownership contribute to an agenda for radical economic democracy and a new kind of alternative economic system. So what I want to say today is very much in line with arguing the case for public ownership, and in particular a range of different forms of public ownership, both traditional state forms, but also a whole range of diverse and alternative forms than we've had in the past. I should also say, I think before I launch into the presentation, that there's two projects that you may be interested in that are ongoing at the moment. One with Vedran and others, it's been funded by the EU, which has just started recently, on municipal energy, where we're trying to identify best practice around Europe in terms of things going on at the local town and city level that we think represent best practice, both in terms of moving rapidly towards a post-carbon transition, but also, as importantly, developing democratic and participatory forms of citizen municipal, citizen local state relations that I think are critical really to achieving a transition. Because I think the big problem with transition politics is for many of the population out there across the world, it's still seen perhaps as an elite or niche politics, and we need to make it more mainstream. And if there's one take-home point from what I'm going to say today, it's really the importance of public participation and citizen engagement with the transition project. And I'm sure we all hold those views, but easy to believe that, but very difficult to know what we do about engaging a broader public. But I think public ownership is
information about that group. How do you spell it?
Very important part of that. The project is called Empower, M-P-O-W-E-R.
And Vedran, you said?
Vedran is involved. There's a whole, the Institut, Political Ecology.
How do you spell it?
Hey?
How do you spell Vedran?
Vedran, well, he's the guy at the back here. But it's if you type in Empower EU municipal energy, I think you'll find the project. I think we've only just started, but I think the project is now, the website's live. The second project, just to mention, is, and I'll be saying a little bit more about this in my talk. We've just got another project funded by the EU. It's bizarre to get quite radical projects funded by the EU, given that many of us here criticise them for being neoliberal all the time. But there's a new project that starts in January, which is a global study of the remunicipalisation trend that I'm going to talk about a little bit today. So I can maybe answer questions about that later on. Okay. So what I'm going to argue today is that public ownership is a critical part of what we need, the strategy, the pathway that we need to achieve a just transition. And I think, as I suggested, part of that is to really try to develop a more radical sense of public engagement with some of the key questions, some of the key issues around economic development that face us in our time. Because I think one of the problems that we face at the moment, and whatever we want to call the economic system that we have at the moment, whether we want to call it neoliberalism, globalization, or a kind of, I think it's more accurate to call it a globalized neoliberalism in a sense. And there's lots of debates about what neoliberalism means and whether it's mutating into a different form of economic system. And I think that's an open question at the moment. But I think there are three things that we can identify as part of neoliberalism that really at the root of our current crisis and what's affecting us at the moment. And there's a marketization, privatization, and financialization. And I'm not going to say a lot about those things. I think they're pretty self-evident to the audience here. But it's quite clear that those dominant trends in economic policy making and economic development are leading to a situation of massive crisis, and that's a political crisis, an ecological crisis, and also perhaps a social crisis as well. And I think again, I think we're talking to the converted here, and one of the things I'm always wary about when I'm doing sort of activism work around public ownership is we need to get out and talk to the rest of the population, not just the converted, but I mean, we've got to start somewhere. But I think we need a very different set of economic relationships beyond, because I think the kind of privatized corporate model of economic globalization that we have is responsible for these trends that we can identify, and it's very much tied up with them. We need a very different set of economic relationships, and those relationships really have to point the economy firmly and radically in the direction of what Thomas Hanna and I have called in a recent paper that we've done for the Labour Party team, democratic collective ownership. I think this is the sort of agenda that we need to follow, and public ownership is a critical part of that. So what I've outlined in various papers, but also in a book that I've written on the topic, is that we need to completely rethink what public ownership is. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But in particular, I think we need to recognize the need for different forms of public ownership that are needed in different contexts and different circumstances. So we still need to engage with the state. We still need to think about non-state forms of collective ownership, such as cooperatives and employee-owned firms as well. We also perhaps need to sort of experiment a bit more with more hybrid forms of ownership that involve multi-stakeholder models. And I think we need forms of public ownership as well that are what geographers would call multi-scalar. We need ownership at different scales, depending on the circumstances, the context, the technical requirements of different sectors, and so on and so forth. So, if I'm not going to dwell on climate change, because again, I think we hopefully we're talking to an audience here that's all too well aware of the concerns, but. One of the, I think, one of the most interesting movements and campaigns recently is a movement that you may have come across called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, which started in the US but is now trying to develop, spread its wings into Europe and further afield. But very much the motivating force behind TUED is a guy called Sean Sweeney, and he's referred to climate change as what he calls a civilizational catastrophe. I'm not sure if that comes from him originally, but I think it captures very, very well the fact that climate change is not just a disaster in terms of all the trends we're experiencing, but I think it's kind of a sort of dual-edged disaster, dual-edged catastrophe, because the other catastrophe as part of climate change is the way that policymakers are dealing with it. Yeah, dominant policy discourse, even by those who recognise that climate change is a problem. Of course, we can think about Lord Stern's report that came out a few years ago. Most of the key policies that have been developed at a higher scale are still working within a framework of broadly of a kind of neoliberal means of addressing climate change, which is to advocate marketized solutions, carbon markets, etc., still leaving much of the key agency for dealing with climate change in the hands of private and corporate actors, and not surprisingly, that's massively failing. I can give you two examples of that from two of the most important countries that we need to tackle climate change. If you look at the US and you look at something like oil production, this is a little bit out of date, obviously 4 or 5 years out of date, but I think you can see the key trend I want to identify here. If we look at some of the key trends in terms of fossil fuels, it's clear that whilst there's been a decline in fossil fuel consumption and production in recent years, it's gone back up again, and I think that has a lot to do with the kind of incentive structure and the marketization that's still there in terms of dealing moving away from carbon sources, and even more worryingly, if you look at Germany, which obviously, compared to the US, is more firmly committed, at least its government is nominally firmly committed to tackling climate change through its energy vendor. Even in Germany, we're seeing that despite some significant advances in reducing the dependence on fossil fuels, coal production has increased massively, dramatically again after 2010-11. Lots of complicated reasons for that, but I think the basic fact I would draw attention to is that most of the actors who are we're relying upon, if you like, to deliver a transition beyond to a post-carbon economy and dealing seriously with climate change, most of the actors have vested interests that still have a massive interest in the old carbon-based economy. And you know, if we think about techno-fixes, Green New Deals, I think these are either failing to take hold of policy making in a serious way, or in many ways, some of the things that are being proposed potentially could deal with climate change, but they could actually exacerbate divisions and reinforce existing patterns of inequality. So I think we need a very different kind of set of solutions and discourses that if we're really going to get to grips with what climate change is and how we deal with it. And I think that means, for me, confronting the very nature of the economy, the structure of power relations that dominate it, and moving to a very different kind of system. And as I've argued at length in various places, I think pushing public ownership back to the centre of the policy-making agenda is a critical part of that project. So my argument, I think, with many others, is that we really do need radical social transformation of our economic system if we're going to deal with climate change. There's no two ways about it. And I think one of the interesting things that comes out of the TUED project, which Sean Sweeney's fronting up, is really an attempt to try and push trade unions away from a kind of soft, growth-driven Green Deal agenda that delivers jobs for their members, to actually say, well, look, come on, we need to get real. We need, you know, this isn't working anyway. And anyway, you know, growth, development, the kind of modernization agenda, economic modernization agenda that's perhaps developed and dominated many economies, the kind of social democratic model in which trade unions were involved as a vested interest in economic development, is something we need to really fundamentally challenge. And I think public ownership is critical to this for the obvious reason that if we begin to take key assets, resources, infrastructures back into public control and away from the kind of devastating consequences of privatization, I think it's already an important step in the right direction. But the other thing I think about this is it will begin to challenge the kind of vested interests that have been wrapped up in the carbon-based economy, and it'll hopefully create a very different set of economic and social values. And I firmly believe that if we can develop public ownership in a more democratic way, where the broader public, broader citizens are involved, you know, I mean, a lot of people ask me the question, well, how do you know if we have democratic forms of public ownership when we involve the average citizen, they're actually going to, you know, vote for the things that you want, for a more ecological and socially just model? And my response to that, the more I think about it, is actually the average person is not really interested in commercial values, you know, in profit making, if you think about what really motivates people in their lives. And if you can create a democratic, knowledgeable public, and it's a hard task, I think you do get different kinds of solutions. And we'll see maybe an example or two of that later on. So, for me, public ownership is an important starting point. But I think what we need to recognize is that public ownership, in the way it's been practiced in the past, has also had very few friends, very few allies. If you look at the traditional forms of public ownership, I'm talking really here about the kind of centralized model of state ownership that was developed in many countries around the world after 1945. It has quite rightly been critiqued severely on all sides of the political spectrum. The right, of course, didn't like it in the 1970s because they saw an overweening state gradually choking the economy, cutting off private enterprise, individual liberty, although I think that's a very thing we can dispute quite a bit today. But I think the right, in particular, people like Hayek, who, of course, was Thatcher's favourite philosopher, they developed a very devastating critique of the bureaucracy, the over-centralisation, and the removal from the ordinary citizen of economic decision-making that resulted in the kind of post-war 1945 model of public ownership. And, of course, that then, because those forms of state ownership were so far removed from the lives of ordinary citizens, in many countries they were seen as basically part of a civil service elite, or even worse, they became organisations that were open to corruption and narrow party politicking. It was quite easy, particularly in the UK where I come from, it was quite easy for the Thatcherites to attack older forms of state ownership, especially when you have control of a corporate media which is privately owned and tends to be against state intervention in the economy anyway. Very easy for the right to attack and dismantle much of the old state-owned infrastructure. On the left, of course, in the 1970s in particular, there was a growing critique of this older model of state ownership from all kinds of left tendencies and traditions, from the autonomous tradition, from syndicalist traditions, and from anarchist traditions that were rightly critical of the way that, you know, the state, when it took control of different sectors of the economy, although it was nominally acting on behalf of the public had very little say in what was going on in the kind of institutions. I can give you one example from the UK that really demonstrates the problem. If you look at the UK in the 1950s and the 60s, the nationalised energy system that we had shifted very, very dramatically towards nuclear power, largely because of the influence of the armed forces and the defence and the military establishment in the UK, which obviously clearly wanted nuclear power for its own ends. But there was almost no public discussion of nuclear power and its implications and its failings and the problems down the line. And that was very different, of course, to other countries across Western Europe, like Denmark, for example, or Germany, that had a much more kind of dramatic public debate and an oppositional movement against nuclear power. But there are lots of examples, too, of how an overweening centralised state model of public ownership has had disastrous consequences. So I think those are valid criticisms, but for me, I would still defend the right or the importance of some form of state intervention and ownership in a kind of post-transition economy, because I think we should remember that the state, the national state in particular, can still do things and achieve strategic goals that smaller scale action, local action, municipal action cannot. So if you go back again to the post-1945 model that was applied in France, for example, and the UK, despite all the criticisms that I and others have made of those nationalisation processes, they did achieve some important social goals. They basically widened the universal provision of basic services like electricity and so on. That they were important in helping to develop a universal welfare state. The National Health Service in Britain, still the most popular institution in the UK, emerged out of that experience of nationalisation. And also they did improve employment conditions. If you look at the coal industry, for example, in the UK, the health and safety conditions and the employment conditions of the workers in the coal industry after 1945 was massively better than the kind of private industry that existed before. So I think we need to recognise that state action at a national level is still important for achieving, you know, longer-term state goals and setting objectives and agendas at a national level. But of course, you know, we need to ask serious questions about what kind of state we want and what kind of relations we want with society. It's worth saying that for all the successes of the British and French post-war economic models, if you like, in reducing inequality and improving the conditions of the population, of course, nature and the environment were not just not considered, but of course, nature was the kind of victim of this kind of economic modernisation program that we had in the UK, France, and even further afield if you look at other countries as well. So I think the question we need to pose is, if you hold with my argument that we need higher level public ownership and we still need some kind of state intervention, what kind of relations do we want to construct between the state and society and nature as part of a transition politics? And of course, the interesting thing about the failings of privatisation is public ownership is coming back onto the political agenda. And I think the interesting thing about this trend is it's happening right across the political spectrum. It's happening under relatively right-wing governments. It's also happening under governments of the centre, pragmatic governments. But of course, it's happening with a few experiments on the left as well. Last year, as some of you will know, we had a general election in the UK, and the Corbyn leadership of the Labour Party, which I'll say a little bit more about their agenda in a minute, the Corbyn leadership of the Labour Party what was seen as a disaster by a lot of people, expected to lose the election heavily to Theresa May and the ever increasingly right-wing Brexiteering Tories. And I think the interesting thing, and perhaps the most remarkable thing about Corbyn, is that Labour nearly won the election. They ran the Tories a very close race, and the Tories ended up with no overall majority government, of course. And I think it's worth remarking upon the fact that that happened despite continuing massive divisions within the Labour Party between the left and the continuing kind of legacies of Tony Blair, New Labour, that kind of slightly right-wing politics that had been very much dominating the Labour Party up until then. So the Corbyn project was massively successful, if you like, if you think about the different enemies it was fighting at the same time. But I think what was behind it was some of the policies that it was beginning to advocate, and particularly policies around public ownership and taking back a lot of the privatised industries in the UK back into public hands. There was a poll that was conducted just after the election, and this was conducted by a right-wing think tank called the Legatum Institute, a bunch of private school-educated elite schoolboys that running these kind of think tanks. And of course, they were horrified by the election result. They were horrified by the fact that Theresa May's majority had collapsed, that Labour, under one of the most radical left-wing manifestos in recent history, had got over 40% of the popular vote. So they decided to do an opinion poll. And what did they find? Well, even as much as the election result horrified them, the results of their opinion poll horrified them 10 times more, I think, because what they found, of course, was that public ownership was massively popular. They found that 83% of the population wanted to renationalise the water sector, 77% electricity and gas, 76% railways, not just majorities, but massive majorities in favour of renationalisation. And I think perhaps the thing that scared them most, and you've got to remember we live in the UK in a media context where public ownership is hardly talked about. The media is very privately, apart from the BBC, is very privately dominated and run by large corporate interests. But they found that even 50% of the public wanted to see the whole banking system renationalised. So this is pretty remarkable stuff, and it shows you what public support there is out there. Despite almost no discourse or mainstream discourse about public ownership in the last 30 to 40 years. They found that also part of the findings, they found that capitalism was held in much lower esteem than socialism, shock horror, viewed as badly as communism, interesting, and there was very much a view that the economic system we had encourages greediness, selfishness, and corruption. So they came away slightly dismayed, to say the least, at these findings. But what they show is how much broader support there is for public ownership and why it's coming back onto the policy agenda. So we can see this happening in Latin America, of course, which in many ways was the forerunner. The shift to the left in the early 2000s, the forerunner of some of the things that we're beginning to see, I think, in Europe. But even in Europe, we're seeing at the national level different privatised industries coming back into public control. The most recent is the Portuguese centre-left government has taken back a 51% share in its privatised airline just recently. So at the national level, we're seeing a shift towards public ownership. But I think the thing that's really caught on amongst left activists around the world is the growth in local forms of municipal ownership that are emerging, something that's being referred to increasingly as the global remunicipalisation wave, where since 2000, and we're talking about quite a dramatic phenomenon when you think about it, since only 2000, in the last decade and a half, the Transnational Institute, which has done a fantastic job in mapping the phenomenon. There's a very good report which you can download online by Satoko Kishimoto and colleagues, where they've identified over 800 cases of remunicipalisation around the world. And again, the dramatic thing, just to say in passing, is the kind of geographical spread and the political diversity of these processes. It's local governments of the right as well as the left that are ending privatisation contracts, taking franchises back under public control. So obviously one of the epicentres of it, as many of you will know, is Germany, which has had over 300 local remunicipalisations since 2000, a lot of those in the energy sector, and I think there's a contributing factor there of the political push towards the Energiewende, which I think the radical green and left movements can take can be praised for considerably. But I think what's interesting is we also see quite massive remunicipalisation in the US, the heartland of capitalist private enterprise, where socialist bastions like Houston and Atlanta are beginning to take back their water services in particular into public ownership. So I think this is a very interesting phenomenon, and it's excited a lot of attention. And I think it's very important, and I think I've seen there's various workshops and things here talking about the importance of municipal action and how the local is where politics starts, and I would certainly hold with that agenda, but I do think it's insufficient if we're going to really move to a wider system change to tackle climate change. And I think if you think of the scale of the problem that we're facing, and if you think, for example, that in Germany you're talking about, I can't remember what the latest figure is, but 40 billion euros or something just to modernise the infrastructure. That's clearly of a scale that you cannot achieve under our current economic system at the local level. You need massive national state action, even if it's only an enabling state that allows local public ownership and democracy to flourish. And I think one of the more interesting things I've seen recently is by some people in the US who I recommend you read some of their work, Gal Alperovitz, Joe Greenan and Thomas Hanna, who work for the Democracy Collaborative in Washington, which is a really interesting think tank, which has got a whole series of initiatives around what they call the Next System Project, which is self-explanatory about what that's about. But one of their ideas that they recently had an article in the centre-left or the left of centre magazine in the US, The Nation, which again you can find online, is that we could use, in the same way that quantitative easing was used to bail out the financial sector after the financial bless you. You okay? In the same way that the financial sector was bailed out by quantitative easing, which was something we were told we couldn't do. We couldn't just print money for government policy purposes. They come up with a very radical proposal that actually in the US the federal government could actually buy out the whole fossil fuel industry to close it down through a quantitative easing program. I think they've estimated it would cost about 1.7 trillion, which sounds like a lot of money, but it's about the same amount of money that the US has spent on its wars in the Middle East since the invasion of Afghanistan. And actually, if you did it through quantitative easing, it wouldn't actually affect the public purse in terms of everyday public spending. So I think these are the kind of ideas, and these are the kind of the big solutions that we need to begin to advocate and talk about. I've written about this kind of stuff in more academic papers about how we need to be in, against, and beyond, but also engaging with state actors to kind of achieve the kind of changes that we want. And I think there's a copy of the PowerPoint which will be available for people to look at. So the last thing I want to talk about is the developments in the UK around the Labour Party agenda on new forms of public ownership. What I find fascinating about this agenda is not just that there is a set of policy commitments to renationalise many of the sectors that Thatcher privatised, because I think, as we've seen, that's very popular politics. That's not surprising. But I think the tone of the kind of documents that are coming out of the Labour Party programme are really interesting as well, for the way that they're really emphasising democracy and radical democracy. And they're really emphasising the way that we need a different form of economy, as you'll see from the quote here, to achieve the kind of social justice that left of centre parties are supposed to be about. So in the manifesto, it talks about Britain being a long-established democracy. Well, some of us might disagree with that, about what democracy means there in a country that's still ruled by somebody who happened to be born in the right bed. But nevertheless, I think this is important. This bit's important. The distribution of ownership of the country's economy means that decisions about our economy are often made by a narrow elite. More democratic ownership structures would help our economy deliver for the many and lead to a fairer distribution of wealth. Now, this might not seem very novel to the audience in this room, but I think from the Labour Party, leader of the Labour Party, this is quite a radical commitment, because we're talking about, we're talking about one of the biggest countries in Europe, and we're talking about one of the most established left of centre parties. So I think this is important stuff. a document that actually captures the mood really well is a report that they wrote, or some of us were involved in writing as well, around about the time of the election campaign, called the Alternative Models of Ownership Report. And I think alternative models is quite a key term there, because what's being advocated here isn't a return to older forms, one model of top-down centralized state ownership, but the report's advocating a whole diversity of models. State ownership at a higher level is part of that, but also the report talks very enthusiastically about how we encourage and we regulate to encourage local cooperatives, how we encourage community ownership. Where I come from in Scotland, community ownership is quite a big agenda item of the Scottish government, which I think is a good thing. And it also talks about how we might create more worker-owned or employee-owned companies as well. And I think it's fair to say that this is pretty well received. A lot of the critics on the right and in the mainstream wanted to just be able to dismiss and rubbish Labour's plans, but in a way they were wrong-footed, I think, because they were surprised at the diversity and the nuance and sophistication of the kinds of economic relations that were being discussed in this report. So I think it was a very important stepping stone. And I think we need to be quite clear. While public ownership is coming back, it's not enough. We need a particular form. We need a more radical democratic form. Because I think the danger that we might see as the evidence of privatization's failures and the need for radical state action becomes increasingly evident, we may just see governments taking back ownership and control of big enterprises in the utilities, but not really doing anything about the management structure, not doing anything about the basic values underpinning public ownership. And in fact, if we look at the UK as a good example again, when the government was forced to nationalise the banking sector to stop the whole economy collapsing in 2009 after the financial crisis, I think what was quite instructive was that they left or they brought in bankers from the private sector to run the state-owned bank that they bailed out. So in a way, you're bringing the foxes in to run the chicken coop that they've themselves destroyed, if you like, through their previous actions. And I think we need to be clear to guard against that. We need a very different form of public ownership. The kind of nationalisation that was developed after the financial crisis was described very aptly by one group of leftists as socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor. Because what that public ownership did in the US and the UK and other parts of the world as well is it kind of tidied up the mess made by the deregulated financial sector, always with the intention that this was a short-term phenomenon, and when normal conditions resume, and I think we're a long way from normal conditions myself, but when normal conditions resume, there was always the intention that these assets would then be handed back to the private sector when they were profitable again. Okay, so the state, the public absorbs all the costs, of course, and austerity is an outcome of that. And then when the time is right, the idea would be to hand these resources back from the public sector to the private sector. So we need to distinguish between a more radical form of public ownership and some of the kind of mainstream forms that might emerge in the next few years, and be very clear that we're talking about democratic public ownership, not nationalisation. The other trend I think that we should be very worried about on the left and amongst progressives is the extent to which the populist right is now resorting to their own forms of public state ownership. We see nationalisation becoming a very big part of the agenda amongst some pretty nasty right-wing governments. Can anybody tell me what the government in Europe that has carried out the most nationalisations has been in the last few years? Hungary, yeah, very good. And I think that tells you all you need to know. Nationalisation there is, of course, equated with taking back control of our economy from nasty foreigners. And there's the same discourse you find as well in Poland. So I think, the right is beginning, and Marine Le Pen has been talking a long time about the benefits of nationalisation. So I think we need to be clear that if we don't get on this agenda on the left in a democratic, participatory, inclusive way, the right will steal our clothes. We also need to go beyond, and I'll draw things to a close here. We also need to go beyond the older social democratic model of public ownership that we see in some Nordic countries, because I think whilst there are some quite interesting examples of forms of public ownership that have been quite democratic, they've had worker involvement, they've been open to public scrutiny and values, and Statoil, which I write about quite a bit in my book, was a very interesting example of quite a centralized top-down form of public enterprise, but nevertheless was open to democratic scrutiny via various state mechanisms and parliamentary committees. But nevertheless, it was still an enterprise that was ultimately committed to growth, development, and a kind of economic modernization project. Not really where we want to go. Another interesting example is if anyone's ever flown into Copenhagen and you fly over the offshore wind farm that's there, that's a really interesting example of public ownership, because it was originally created as a hybrid enterprise between the local Copenhagen city government and a specially created cooperative. So I think that's a very interesting development, and it does try and empower and bring citizens into public enterprise. But again, I think as good as the Danish model and the Copenhagen model of transition is, it perhaps doesn't. It still tries to kind of marry up sustainability values with a broader economic development and growth agenda. What I'm more interested in is interesting examples like the Banco Popular in Costa Rica, which was a public bank, state bank created around about 40 years ago now, which created a multi-stakeholder governance structure whereby employees had ownership shares and were able to vote for the policy of the company. And it has a constituent assembly of over 200 elected representatives that set the grand strategic goals of the enterprise. And unsurprisingly, from my perspective, this enterprise is one of the most socially and ecologically forward-looking enterprises that you can find anywhere on the planet. So I'm going to finish here, and I think there's lots here I hope to debate and take forward, but for me I think there's 4 defining characteristics of democratic public ownership. The first is that we need to be clear that our value system is driven by a common good rather than looking after particular vested interests or just creating forms of enterprise that give workers a stake in the enterprise. We need to make sure that public ownership has the values of what we in the UK would call the common good. And I think if we insert the idea that we're looking after the common good in the present, but also for future generations, I think that begins to develop an agenda where we can talk about valuing the planet, nature, the environment, and everything else as part of our discussions. I do think we need to think very carefully about the institutional structures and the mechanisms that can create what I would call more dispersed decision-making across an economy, so that an elite group cannot capture both decision-making and knowledge about how the economy works. I think that's one of our critical problems at the moment. We don't have a public participating enough in economic decision-making. I haven't said much about this, but I do think we need to recognize there's no one model here. I think one of the problems of left utopian projects in the past, in the 20th century, was they had one model of what socialism looked like, and if you didn't fit within that, you were put out of business, or at the worst, you were kind of exterminated. I think if you look at Soviet socialism and a lot of those projects of the 20th century, they actually extinguished a lot of traditional municipal and mutualism that existed, particularly in rural areas. So I think we need different forms, and we have to recognise that not all sizes will, or we need to recognise that we need more than one model overall. And then I think the final thing is that we really need to make sure that public enterprises, if things do begin to come back into the public sector on a massive scale, that I hope will happen, we need to make sure these enterprises are the incubators for deliberative and participatory democracy, because I think that's the way that we begin to counter what various people are talking about as a democratic deficit and the threat of the far right. And I'm just going to finish with this quote. I'll let you read it yourself from John Dewey. Written almost a century ago now, and he was a kind of radical liberal, I suppose. He wouldn't be somebody that the left would normally recognise as a fellow traveller. But I think his point here about democracy will fail if democratic processes are not just embedded in electing representatives every 4 or 5 years, but they need to be broadly. You need to roll out democratic processes across society and the economy more broadly. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
We have like 10 minutes for discussion now, and then we'll continue with the growth model immediately at 10:10.
First, thank you for this very kind of comprehensive presentation. It's kind of very refreshing to see how it's rooted in the real-life politics and kind of practicalities of real-life politics. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll just limit myself to two. First, I wanted to, because you mentioned a bit of like this cooperation with labor, and I'm interested also whether there is any kind of similar kind of something in Scottish National Party, SNP, like whether there's any kind of similar approach to kind of put forward these kind of issues. And the other one is, I'm kind of perplexed also by this public poll, which is which is kind of saying all these things that, but then again, you know, the conservatives are winning, and it's something similar like here. If you would go like in any of the countries, I think of the region, and you do the poll, you will come up with very kind of egalitarian views and everything, but then right is winning all the time. So I'm kind of just maybe a bit of thinking what we are doing wrong.
I'll deal with the Scottish question first. That's the easy one. I mean, actually, it's very interesting. I'm a supporter of the Scottish independence, so I'll say that. But I'm not a member of the Scottish National Party. So I think there is a broader project in Scotland to have a more I think during the independence campaign, the most important political movement was something called the Radical Independence Campaign, which was a left-wing grassroots campaign that took support for independence from around about 30% to 45% in less than a year, which was an incredible mobilisation, because all the established parties were against it, with the exception of SNP. The SNP has been, I think, forced to shift to the left. It's quite a centrist party, I think. On social issues, it's to the left. It's a long way to the left of the Conservatives on all kinds of things, from abortion rights to gender rights to lesbian and gay rights and so on. For example, I think it's quite progressive, and it wants to do the right thing. It tries to push gender equality, for example, its own party. It's got a really for something that's called a nationalist party, you'd be surprised at how many members it has that are Muslims or Asians from the Asian community in Scotland, and potentially its next leader could be an Asian, which I think is worth remarking upon what kind of nationalism this is. For me, it's a very civic nationalism. I'm not a supporter of that party, though, because they're not socialist. There will be socialists who are part of the party, and there is a left and a right and a centre, if you like. But I think, nevertheless, they've been forced to move a little bit to the left by the whole Corbyn phenomenon in London. So one of the things that they're now doing, and they're doing it as a government, they're basically setting up a public bank, and they're setting up a public energy company. Now, and one of the things I need to do when I get back to Glasgow is write a submission to the public consultation process. But in a way, they don't really know what they're going to do with these banks. So the public bank is going to support small and medium-sized businesses, economic development. There's a very strong Green Party in Scotland, which is actually it's not in government, but it gives support to the Scottish nationalists on particular issues, because the Green Party is also pro-independence. So I think the Green Party is pushing them a little bit in the right direction on green environmental issues. So they are committed to, I think, more public enterprise. I did read also they've built twice as much social housing in Scotland as they have in the UK per head, but that's not saying a lot, because the Tories don't want to build any social housing. So it's better, but it tells you still they're quite limited in their ambitions. So I think it's important that they're moving in that direction, and I think we shouldn't, as people on the left, dismiss them, because I think we have to recognise you can change political identities too a little bit, and shift and what we want to do is shift the political pendulum in the right direction. So I think I would still recognise what's going on in Scotland, and it's quite important, and it's a terrain for interesting experimentation. I mentioned community ownership in Scotland, in the Highlands and Islands, where you have a lot of old rural communities. There's a big campaign to basically buy back land and use it for all kinds of interesting things like producing renewable energy, which is really a big political issue at the moment, because most of Scotland is actually owned by a very small number of people. Land ownership is incredibly concentrated in Scotland, and so that's a big political issue as well. So I think that's all very interesting in Scotland, and it's we'll see how it develops. But I think they have been pushed to the left more than they would want to be, and I think you've got to engage with that. You've got to if they don't know why they're setting up a public bank, you need to get in there and be part of the discussion and telling them that they need to fund renewable energy, community ownership projects, because they're kind of halfway there if you get the right person in the ministry. But activism can push it further, I think. Labour. Sorry, what was the question about Labour again?
No, it was not about Labour, but about this poll. I mean, which is saying basically, how many people are for this kind of policies, and then still Labour loses.
I think it's worth saying that privatisation was never popular in the UK. Yeah. If you even go back to the when I was researching my book, what I found amazing, if you go back to the 1980s, you very rarely would see a majority favouring privatisation. Even when they were selling off shares in gas and in the British Telecom, which was the first one, they sold shares to individuals. Individuals could buy shares, and because they deliberately priced the companies low when they sold them off to the stock market, they knew that the price would go up, the share price would go up. So individuals could buy shares and sell them on within a week or two and make a lot of money, But even with all that, they didn't convert the public in the UK to massive supporters of privatisation, So this wasn't a surprise to me, and there have been opinion polls, but I think what's surprising is that these figures are going up. And I think they're going up because we've had the difference between the UK perhaps and Eastern parts of South and Eastern Europe is we've had privatisation for about 30 years. We've had the experiment. People know it doesn't work. People who are the regular users of water services, of rail especially, in the UK, which is a disaster zone, and rail energy prices are very high. People can see with their own eyes. We've had the experiment where we're ahead of the rest of the world, and I think this is why we now have a resurgent left politics in the mainstream party, I think, because people are aware that the neoliberal experiment has failed. So I think that's the difference between why it's popular in the UK. Why didn't Labour win? I think Labour didn't win because Labour was very divided. I think Corbyn. I remember going to a seminar like this one where Corbyn and John McDonnell were both. This was in Glasgow. They were both there with their economics teams to come and talk about public ownership and alternatives. And I remember they had a massive ballroom, in one of these big conference venues, which would seat about 500 people. And this was maybe 4 or 5 months before the election campaign, when they were 20 points behind in the opinion polls. And so you had a room of about 500 people. You had both the leader of the opposition and the shadow and the deputy leader in the room in Glasgow, and there were maybe 80 people there in the room, and most of them were older than me and male. So. And that was before the general election campaign. When we got into the general election campaign, actually, suddenly all the media, there are media rules in the UK whereby you have to give balanced coverage to, and suddenly I think Corbyn was being talked about in terms of the ideas and the thinking, not being given the public weren't being given the right-wing view about how he's a supporter of terrorists and all these other things. And when they actually saw him and his vision and his politics, then I think. I think they went from being around about 35% in the opinion polls to over 40% within about 4 or 5 weeks. So I think if they'd had, but they were still fighting a battle within their own Labour Party to win control of the party. Most of their MPs are against him, and they were against him right up until the election. So I think the reason they didn't win the UK was because they were fighting their own party as well as the rest of the country and the corporate media. Pretty remarkable that they did as well as they did. In the rest of the world, I don't know. I think you've got to work with the local politics, and that's an easy question to say. But I suspect in lots of parts of Eastern Europe, the idea of state ownership is still very tainted with the whole experience of the former communist period. Even though in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, you had a different kind of self-managed, more decentralized communism, it was still. I think the experience is still very fresh of what the state does, and that's wrapped up. And I think you've got to distinguish politics here from what's happening there. So the left progressive agenda here, maybe you need different thinking around how you appeal to people to go beyond it. But I mean, to be honest. I think people will quite quickly work out that the kind of nice individual freedoms of capitalism that promises are very restricted and constrained. If you look at, I mean, I was in Slovenia recently, and you look at the employment statistics and how many younger people are not being able to find the regular, full-time, paid, decent work that their parents and their grandparents had. And you can, I think there are ways that you can begin to develop an agenda around a different kind of politics. But again, it's not a one-size-fits-all model. You can't apply what's happening in the UK to what's happening here. Sorry, that's a very long answer.
So it's now maybe first a woman because gender. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit, kind of more concretely, sort of what kind of models of democratic control, for instance, are you advocating for, or have you come across in your research? Because we often talk about public ownership and democratic ownership, and kind of on what level that should be managed. Yeah. But yeah, I'm interested in the kind of processes that, talk more about the control than the ownership.
Okay. I think we're in the middle of writing a paper for the Labour Party on these issues, actually, with one of the guys who produced the report about the fossil fuel industry in the US. And one of the things we're quite clear about is kind of multi-stakeholder assembly models, where you basically have a democratic. I think control is important. You have democratic control of the vision and the values of the company. That would need some kind of constituent assembly if it's perhaps a national company that meets to decide the values every 4 or 5 years. But you would also want the things that we see in social democratic countries at the moment, where with co-determination, with worker involvement, you'd want decent working rights and everything else. But I think we're quite clear. I'm quite clear that I don't want models that just give the workers, rights of a say in the corporation, but don't involve the broader citizenship. Because if you look at Germany with the energy industry, a lot of the trade unions have been against some of the taking back of, privatized utilities into public ownership because they have very good deals with some of the big private corporate companies. If you look at a place like Hamburg, where there was a big referendum to take back the grid from private control, the trade unions were very opposed because the workers are looked after very well deliberately by Vattenfall, and have these cozy deals, and they're afraid that if they move back into the public sector, their conditions of work will deteriorate. That's a real concern that you have to address. You can't just dismiss that. And I think this is why I think the work of Sean Sweeney and the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy is really good, because they talk about, well, how we've got to you have to reach out and take these workers in the old carbon industries into consideration. We don't have to, we don't have to buy into that the argument completely, but I think you do need to think about how you develop multi-stakeholder models that begin to allow public enterprises that do things like train people decently, give good conditions of work, that even through their own practices articulate different values about what working, perhaps thinking about working time and all the kind of more progressive elements of how you can redesign the labour market. So I think these public enterprises have to have those values in them. And that inevitably means that you have to have kind of multi-stakeholder models, I think, but you also involve broader citizens, not just workers in their the kind of makeup of the composition of these companies. So when we've done our first draft of the report, because the Labour Party said, can you write us a report about what democratic public ownership looks like? Because you've been talking about it and we've heard you speak, but we want some concrete policy. So we actually came up with a report, and we put in there a concrete set of proposals about what kind of structures. We really like this Costa Rican Banco Popular. I'd recommend. There's a good article in there's an online journal called The Conversation. And there's a good article in there. I've forgotten the guy's name, but it's about the bank and it's how it works. So we put in a series of proposals about what this should all look like. We're probably a bit more prescriptive than we could have been, but the Labour Party said, well, we really like this, but can we take out your proposals because we want to have a debate with a broader membership, which is kind of fair enough. So we are thinking about these things. I mentioned hybrid models, which I quite like, whereby a lot of local. You see it in the energy sector in Germany in particular. There's the town of Wolfhagen. Don't know if anybody's come across that. There's a report on that in The Guardian by Dieter Chakraborty, where he went to Wolfhagen. It's a good example of a local town that took back it took back control of its grid from the privatized company, and it's actually used local public control in a very interesting way. It's developed a kind of, I think it's a hybrid cooperative with also some the local government ownership as well. And they've actually used their control of the grid to begin to invest in renewables. And I think they're 100% renewable now after a very short space of time. So there are lots of interesting examples out there of how you can have these models that partly you have part public state ownership, but you try to develop some form of citizen cooperative or engagement. So that, these are beginning to emerge. I'd recommend the transnational institutes work. They're really good on this stuff, and also the Public Services International Research Unit in Greenwich in London. They're really good in documenting some of this stuff. It's easy for people like me because you can come and use their work and make academic pontifications about all this stuff.
Andrew, we have one question here.
Yeah.
Did you want to ask?
Yes. But just 2-3 comments because time is running. I think while speaking about public ownership, we also should speak about governance, which also question education and not being educated to live in democracy. So we need to rethink our educational systems. And also when I speak about education, not only for children, but citizens. And second point, it questions how much time do we have for that? We live in societies where we are all overwhelmed. And very often when you go to people like with massive support for rationalization, they would rather follow a type of rationalization with a lighted elite doing it for them and not to participate in that because people are tired. And that the success also of people like Orban, for example, because he promised to the people to do it for their own interest and so on. And also connected to that, that's the public ownership of media, to have much more diversity in media, which is, I think, also a very, very key problem that connected to both the former ones.
Yeah, I mean, all I can do is agree because I think you're right. I think in the report we talk about how public enterprises should become pioneers in all these kind of things in terms of their working conditions, giving workers time for training, but also I mean, it's not part of this project or my work, but I think the whole working time agenda needs to come back in a radical way on the left as well. Sorts of things that Andre Gortz and others were talking about way back.
Okay, we need to finish because there's another module starting.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much.